أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Respected Amir Sahib, missionary in charge, Ahmadiyya Brotherhood, Your Majesties, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, honored and respected guests, and first and foremost, brothers and sisters, because when we take away titles and privilege and positions, that's what we are. We walk shoulder to shoulder as God's creation on this earth. It is an immense pleasure and privilege, and I thank sincerely the President of the Pan-African Ahmadiyya Muslim Association, Tommy Carlon, for the invitation. I am humbled. I'm humbled and really touched. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have had the distinct honor of working in Africa and living in Africa for many years. I've worked in North Africa, from Tunisia and Libya, West Africa, East Africa, and the Central African Republic and the central areas, the Great Lakes region. But the truth is, long before I had the opportunity to set foot in Africa, I had embraced Africa. And it is this community that gave me that opportunity. I can never remember the loving smile and huge presence of paramount missionary Abdul Wahab Adam Sahib, who we saw on the earlier presentation, whose heart for God and his heart for humanity was as large as the wonderful continent of Africa. And we see today in this very forum a wonderful diversity that, along with Africans that have come here for their association meeting, we have individuals from all races, from all regions, and indeed all religions. I think that is something exceptionally special. And as a child, I remember hearing of Africa. Now, some youngsters don't remember it, but just a few years ago, it's hard to believe there was no internet. And I remember sitting on the mosque floor in some mosque, I think it was in Huddersfield, and there was a summary of a speech by the third Khalifa, who had visited Africa in a tremendous tour. And the love and the teaching that he promoted then was, of course, replicated, and I saw that with my own eyes, in the presence of the fourth Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad. And you could see physically the way he would embrace children from Africa, but children from all races and all religions. There was nothing affected. It was absolutely a spring of love that had no end. And we've seen the same thing with the present Khalifa, and we've seen even on the video today, witness how he embraced and he physically loved people from all corners of the earth, including from the continent of Africa. And of course, in his presence, that was reinforced by his proven service to Africa for years. Nobody could say it better. In those years, he never sought to leave the continent at a time when Africa was much less developed than it is today, because the service of humanity required the service of all God's creatures, including humanity. But, respected brothers and sisters, it had to be thus, because these Khalifas are servants of the Holy Prophet of Islam, the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so before I set foot in Africa, I had heard my father tell me stories about Hazrat Bilal. and the love of the Holy Prophet for him. And who can forget now when people are talking about immigration, who can forget for a moment the special role that Africa had in the early history of Islam, when Muslims were being persecuted terribly. They were saying, Ahad, Ahad, for that crime of believing in the unity of God. They were tortured in the midday sun. And where did they seek refuge first? Not Medina. The first refuge was to go to Abyssinia. So that link between Africa is one of glory. It is one of profound respect, and indeed a debt that I think we owe to the continent. As has been mentioned in the introductions, in July of this year, I was appointed the Special Advisor and Head of the Investigative Team to promote accountability for Daesh, for ISIL. And what compelled me to leave the comfort of my private practice and enter service of the United Nations was the evil that ISIL represents. The tentacles spread from Pakistan and Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, we see it in the Philippines, Tajikistan, of course into Iraq and Syria, up into Africa, Libya. The Sahel region has a real problem also with Daesh returning fighters there and trying to set up their pernicious and evil philosophy. So even before I was appointed, I felt it incumbent upon me to speak about Islam from a legal perspective as the antithesis of violence, as the absolute opposite of intolerance, and that this outfit, this gang of thugs, this rabidly disordered, diseased, contorted philosophy of ISIL is nothing less than the un-Islamic state. And from a religious perspective, we recall, of course, the words of the Holy Quran, "Wal asri idal insan lafi khusrin," in which there was a warning, bear to witness the time when mankind was in a state of abject loss. We've heard reference to the importance of hope, but nobody can say other than at this particular moment in time, the body of humanity is groaning in pains and in suffering that is being afflicted in so many different ways, shapes and forms. So in this venue and on this day, I think it's important to recall not only what is obvious, that the actions of violence that we've seen in so many parts of the world are as different and opposite to Islam as night and day, but to recall what I believe to be a fundamentally important fact. Islam is 610 years younger than Christianity. And if one goes back not even 600 years, goes back 400 years, one would see the terrible, awful, anti-Semitic, racist burning of Jews during the Black Death in Europe. You would see the burning of heretics at the stake, Queen Elizabeth and then Queen Mary, Protestant and Catholic alike, had their skin burnt in the scorching heat of the fire. We would see, of course, the genocide of Muslim and Jew in the Spanish Inquisition. And not even 400 years ago, 200 years ago, look at the genocide, or 300 years ago, the genocide of Native Americans that was ongoing, or how Aborigines were hunted, one day hunting kangaroos and the next day hunting Aborigines. And in the 1960s, a blink away We saw the lynching of black Americans who had been brought as slaves, with the burning cross in the background, with the hooded cowards of the Ku Klux Klan. A message from a messenger that we love and that we revere, whose message was love, who said, if you're slapped, turn the other cheek, who proclaimed with resonance, love thy neighbor like thyself. That message was perverted in the 1960s in the same way that Islam, the beautiful message of Islam, is being perverted by those that call themselves Muslims. So in this context, what are we to do? We should be humble. It's a strange word to say, but we should be humble and to be patient, because without that there's no chance of peace. We should be students of history and the changing tides of civilization, the highs and the lows. And in Islam, we are also taught by our Prophet that wisdom is the lost property of every Muslim. Wherever you see it, seize it, catch it, hold it, and keep it as your own. This word is known by so many children, but it is so deep because it is linked also to the respect and the belief we have as to the truth of the prophets, whether they are Moses or Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, or Prophet Buddha or Prophet Krishna. All prophets, including prophets that definitely 100% blessed the soil of the continent of Africa. This egalitarian spirit is in very short supply today. Very often we reject a message because of who is the messenger. We are seduced by celebrity. We go wide-eyed at billionaires and individuals who appear on televisions. And when they say something, if they are rich, if they are powerful, we tend to listen. And if that message comes from somebody who appears humble, who appears weak, we dismiss it as nonsense. This is not a new phenomenon. This is part of human nature. Understanding these truths is essential for there to be any chance of peace and brotherhood in the world. It was that malady, principally, that led to Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, being rejected. There was no golden throne and empire. There was a humble person who came on a donkey. And he was rejected as, this can't be important, this can't be an important message. And it is actually this very same arrogance that we all have. The arrogance that is within us, that if we don't submit, if we don't subdue it, that we see in the founder, that we see gave rise to the massive opposition to the founder of this community, a small dusty village in India. So I think this truth is very important. For there to be peace, one needs to search out the truth. One needs to search out wisdom and accept it regardless of the source. And one should not go to TV channels or read newspapers for validation. We see it in so many parts of the world, the obvious channels we see. You flick on one channel and the other, and you see it's people watch according to their preset beliefs, not because they are inquiring minds and they're using their God-given brain to critically analyze the merits of different positions. It's the cult of celebrity, not the cult of truth. And this phenomena has been seen in the judicial sphere as well. Not now, back in the ages. It was no less a playwright than William Shakespeare that said, "Plate sin with gold, and the strong lance of justice hurtless breaks. Arm it with rags, and a pygmy straw doth pierce it." This idea that if you are powerful, if you are rich, if you are somebody, you are immune from the rigors of the law. If you are a rich financier, different standards apply. And yet if you are poor, if you are in some parts of the world, particularly we see it in terms of statistics, if you are black, that the legal system disproportionately targets those individuals. This feeling of inequality that has a basis, in fact, is one of the fundamental reasons why there is so much disharmony in so many parts of the world. Spin can take us so far, but these fundamental truths are not lost on individuals, and one does not need to have a doctorate or be a scientist, a rocket scientist, to understand these. These are understood by refugees, by the poorest, or those that have not had the benefit of an education. So, without justice, there is no chance at all of peace. And the fourth Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad, stated in his speech at the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, and it's there in his book, Islam's Response to Contemporary Issues, that peace is the child of justice. And this causal link between peace and justice is something that is an axiom. It simply cannot be denied. But the challenge is to take it from a ritual incantation we hear in halls and conferences around the world into something that has particular meaning. And when I was on the plane coming over here, I had the chance to read again the collection of speeches by the present Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, World Crisis and Pathways to Peace. And it's available on the Ahmadiyya website as a download. And really, when I read that, I thought, what on earth could I say? Because actually, in those collection of speeches, those Friday sermons, and in those letters to religious leaders and secular heads of state and heads of government, there is clear truth as to the situation of the world and the requirement of the hour if one really wishes to move towards peace and brotherhood. So, at the international level, the whole fabric, the whole architecture of international justice, in fact, of international relations, is built upon what should be a rules-based order. We have conventions and we have declarations, we have international law that should be the underpinnings of comity of nations. And not only as a lawyer, my objective assessment is the legal framework we have today is far better, it's far more enhanced, it's far more refined than it was 30, 40 or 50 years ago. But one thing is undeniable, that it is not applied equally. We do not have absolute justice. And this is not a clarion call from heads of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community to talk about absolute justice as a prerequisite for peace. It actually erodes the very fabric of international relations. We see, for example, at the International Criminal Court, that there is murmurings, in fact more than murmurings. There was even hostility and a vibrant dialogue about the fairness of the court that was focusing principally upon African states. Now the reality is this: wherever crimes take place, including in the continent of Africa, individuals should be subject to the law. There was a saying in English history, English jurisprudence, the king is under no man but God and the law. So this idea of all of us being subject to the law is a paradigm principle. But of course it grates when people see one yardstick being used for the weak and another yardstick being used for the powerful. It is that disparity of treatment which gives rise to a significant amount of debate and ultimately brings the international legal order into disrepute. So, how do we move from international treaties and words, utterances, packaged differently, to a world in which peace and brotherhood have some substance, that they are real, not just ideals? As a teenager, I had the blessing to sit during many Majlis Irfan, their question-answer sessions that the Khalifa of the time gives. And I remember that in this question-answer session, the fourth Khalifa said something that made a massive impact upon me. Not speaking in theological terms, complicated theories, abstract concepts. Very simply, he said this: you cannot love an artist and hate his art. You cannot love a musician and hate his music. You cannot love God and hate his creation. Kindness and love is the beginning of piety. It is the beginning of goodness. It is the beginning of decency. Without it, book knowledge renders the individual like the proverbial donkey, overladen with dusty books, without any insight. That human condition of kindness is something that unites all humanity, regardless of faith and regardless of religion. And it is something that is repeatedly emphasized, not only by the Khalifas of the time, in the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, or by the promised Messiah, but by the Holy Prophet of Islam himself. I want to read one quotation I wrote down, and I think it's quite important at this moment in time. We heard by Lord Tariq the awful, heartbreaking news of an attack on a place of worship, our brothers and sisters in the United States at a synagogue. And I think it's important when we go to any mosque and when we think about the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we recall that so many of our brothers and sisters have been killed, have been tortured, have been imprisoned. They have been humiliated in the eyes of their society. And because of the edict of the Khalifas of the time and the promised Messiah, they show patience and they show forbearance. They tolerated. And I recall my late father's, one of his favorite sayings is, "O eagle, do not rail against the wind, do not complain against the wind. It is not there to push you down. It is there to make you rise even higher." And when one sees the progress of this community in every area, including we saw the beautiful video of the Pan-African Ahmadiyya Association, its activities in Africa, and in every walk of life, when we see individuals like Lord Ahmad and other dignitaries here, we see this. But that is a choice we have a right to make, because we are the ones suffering. But we do not have a choice to be passive spectators to evil. We do not have a choice to sit on our chairs in comfort while our brothers and our sisters are in poverty or are tortured. Not only do we have a civil responsibility, not only do we have a religious responsibility, but in this community we were admonished in the clearest terms by the promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, peace be upon him. And he said this in Aina Kalamati Islam at page 559. If a Muslim sees that a fire has broken out in the house of his Hindu neighbor and he does not get up and help in putting it out, I tell you truly, he is not from me. If one of my followers sees a Christian being attacked and does not get up to lend assistance, to rescue him, I tell you truly, he is not of me. This fundamental distinction about soaking up pain for yourself and it not translating into an obligation, an affirmative obligation as an article of faith to help individual regardless of their creed, regardless of the label that they have, whether it is Jew or Hindu or Sikh or Christian or non-believer, but by dint of them being creations of God. That fundamental truth is one of the essential prerequisites for peace to be possible. And as the Holy Prophet of Islam put it, so simply and yet so wisely, that when you see evil, stop it with your hand. And if you cannot stop it with your hand, speak out against injustice wherever you see it. And if for any reason you cannot, at least condemn it in your heart. It was Virgil that said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And we need to be vigilant as to our responsibilities, not only to blame the fault elsewhere, the fault at the macro level, the faults of heads of state, the faults of governments. Again, Shakespeare said, the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. Each of us has the power of choice. Each of us has the responsibility to act. And without that action, without that sense that each individual can make a difference, without that belief penetrating the heart that yes, I am my brother's keeper and I will look after my brother or my sister if they're in difficulties, peace will not be possible. I had a lot more to cover. I think we started a bit late, so I think maybe 5 or 10 minutes, is that right? So I'm told by the President. I want to move on because I know also we're getting close to the time for meals. But one of the areas in this time of crisis, and when we see the version of Islam that is being presented, both the contorted actions of people that call themselves Muslims, and then of course the political opportunism of those individuals that wish to run with it and make hay with that unfortunate situation. There's many things one can talk about. Lord Tariq, I think it was, that talked about the Pact of Medina. One aspect that I think is not mentioned enough is also the covenant of the Holy Prophet of Islam to the monastery at St. Catherine. And I will read that. It was in 628 CE. And it states this, and I quote, "This is a message from Muhammad, son of Abdullah, as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity near and far, for we are with them. Verily I, the servants, my followers, defend them, because Christians are my citizens. No compulsion is to be on them. Neither are their judges to be removed from their jobs, nor their monks from their monasteries. No one is to destroy a house of their religion, to damage it, or to carry anything from it to Muslim houses. Should anyone do this, they will break God's covenant and disobey his prophet. Verily they are my allies and have my secure charter against all that they hate. No one is to force them to travel or fight. The Muslims are to fight for them. If a female Christian is married to a Muslim, it is not to take place without her approval. She is not to be prevented from visiting her church to pray. Their churches are to be respected. No Muslim is to disobey this covenant until the last day. Who can forget the last sermon of the Holy Prophet? Arab is not better than non-Arab. White is not better to black or black to white, except based upon righteousness, an egalitarian principle 1,400 years ago. Imagine the crimes, slavery that have been mentioned, that go on today, and the Prophet of Islam is said people are equal like the tooths of a comb. This charter that is the last sermon that the Prophet of Islam said should be repeated continuously to people even later on until the Day of Judgment, because they may benefit from it more than even people at that time, is something that bears very close reflection. I have to move on. We've talked about brotherhood, and the Holy Prophet of Islam also said, none of you believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. So, why is it that peace and brotherhood constitute the keys to a progressive society, as the question posed suggests? And it was an intimidating question that was posed, not only in its subject matter, but because it was the question that was given to this occasion by Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad. May God support him. Well, it's not only a religious and spiritual admonition that unite great religions, that there should be peace and there should be brotherhood. It's not only to avoid human suffering. It's not only to avoid pain. The genocides that we've seen scar the body of humanity. The violent rapes we've seen far too commonly, whether they're in the Middle East or Africa or Europe or Asia. But it also has another cost. It actually even has a financial cost. So one thinks sometimes, well, politicians and leaders may not be convinced with the moral arguments. But I read a very interesting report called Costs of War by the Watson Institute of International Public Affairs. It's part of Brown University. Brown University is one of the top universities in the United States. And they calculated that in post 9/11 until 2018, $5.6 trillion was spent by the United States alone on armed interventions. So that's $5.6 trillion in that period, 7-year period, on armed interventions. And leaving aside statistics, I have many of them, of those dead and those injured and those millions that are displaced. What was interesting is another report by Professor Garrett Peltier from the University of Massachusetts in May 2017. And she presents an economic argument, the opportunity cost of war. Because whilst domestically in the United States, there is an economic advantage of militarization, because you can spread amongst the states various military expenditure and rearmament. They calculated that education and healthcare expenditure created twice as many jobs and progress than spending the same amount on armaments, whilst clean energy and infrastructure created 40% more jobs than the same amount for military expenditure. But why is this relevant to Africa? It's relevant for many reasons, but one of them is this: at least the United States and those countries that have military capacity, that exporters, that export equipment, their economies are enhanced. Whether it could be better enhanced or not, they are enhanced by building up weapons and selling it. But there is a worrying tendency that we've seen in the world, including upon our beloved continent of Africa, which should ring the alarm bells. In Angola, in 2013, military expenditure went up to 6 billion. In Algeria, 10 billion. Even our very dear Ghana spent 129% more on armaments in 2013 than 2012. If one looks at Jane's Intelligence Weekly and other publications, you will see Chad has Sukhoi jets, Côte d'Ivoire has Mirage jets, South Africa has Gripen fighter bombers, at a time when that money could best be used for the development of the people of Africa. Capacity to defend oneself is important, but in this day and age we've seen economic power is the only route to real independence and autonomy. And with timber, with the oil, with the rare earth, with all the minerals and elements and diamonds and gold, and mostly the people of Africa, that money one should be very cautious about spending it on rearming as opposed to development. So these are not what the Americans call kumbaya principles. They're not edicts and messages that should be confined to the pulpits of churches and synagogues and mosques. They're not esoteric views of political philosophers. They have economic and social implications. So peace and brotherhood are certainly keys to a progressive future. If by progressive we mean not just seeking out technology, but keeping society and the fabric of society together by repairing tears. So if we have the key, where is the lock? The lock are the hearts and minds of each of us. And we need to combine the key with the lock if we're going to have any hope, I suggest, of peace and brotherhood and a peaceful as well as progressive future. Thank you very much.